Hey, g'day, it's Prezzo here. I'm working on this project today. This is a digital clock that I built some time ago, and there's a playlist if you'd like to go and look back at the entire build for this clock. And although it's working the way I want it now, and I'm really happy with the way it performs, I sort of felt like it needed some sort of decorative element on the front of the clock, something like a brand or a logo. And I own a laser cutter engraver, and my initial thought was to finish the clock and then put it in the laser cutter and etch some sort of decorative feature into the front of the clock. Now, that's fraught with danger. Things can go wrong, and the clock at this point was already finished, and there was a lot of effort and work invested in the clock. And I was a bit concerned that something might go wrong at that point and have to scrap the whole thing. So let's have a look at some of the experiments I've done to this point, and I want to try to demonstrate a technique that I've come up with that is adaptable, and you might be able to include it in one of your projects. Okay, this is a prototype for the front of the clock, and it's made from MDF, and you can see that the back of that has been laser cut for the 7-segment displays. The front of it has been veneered with an aspen veneer, so it's good because it's very light. It transmits light easily from the back of that panel there. And I initially put this in the laser cutter engraver, and I just simply etched through the veneer and then backfilled that with a coloured putty. Now the process for this was to first of all clear coat the veneer, and that seals it, and then after the etching process has happened, we backfill that with a water-based wood putty. Now this is the one that I used here. It's ebony, so it's quite black, and when you fill that void left behind after the laser engraving process, you can sand back the surface flush and then put whatever top coat on that you want. So you could use an oil or a lacquer, whatever sort of clear finish that you want over that. And that works perfectly. I even went down to a much smaller size just to show you what sort of resolution you can get with that. And this one here was done with an epoxy glue, so it was just, well, the brand that I used was Araldite, and it's a 24-hour curing variety. The only trouble with that stuff, I'll turn that around the right way, it'll look a bit better. The only trouble with it is that it's slightly cloudy, and any colouring that you put into that epoxy resin will end up looking a bit dull and less than vibrant. So although that allows you to get some sort of colour into the logo, it still wasn't really what I was after. Okay, this was the next step in the development process. These logos were actually cut from solid stock, so it's a sawn piece of wood, it's not veneer. And at this point I'd sort of made up my mind that the best way to go about this was to make the logos detachable. So if anything went wrong, you were just scrapping this one little bit of wood, and there wasn't a lot of time and effort invested in making that. Cutting or doing anything to the entire clock was always going to be a risky process. So these particular type here were cut all the way through on the laser. So instead of having like a recess in the shape of that logo, it was cut all the way through to create a void. That void was then backfilled with a clear epoxy resin, and the epoxy resin gave me the opportunity to add colour and texture to the finished logo using a variety of powders and dyes and other materials. So that's what I want to show you next. I want to show you what I bought to make this process work. Alright, the first material I purchased was this stuff. This is a 2-to-1 mixed clear epoxy resin. Purchased this directly from the website, not from eBay. From the same company I bought this stuff. This is a pigment dye that you mix in with the clear resin. The amount you put in determines the density of the colour. If you want it to be totally opaque, you use a lot. If you just want to have a sort of a tint, you use a small amount. Now, I also purchased this stuff. This is a mica powder. It came from the same website. It's pretty expensive for what you get, a very small amount in these, but you don't need a lot. So it's just a tiny touch with this in the resin, and it will give you that sort of a sparkly textured finish, like a veiny finish. And I also purchased this, which is basically just a coloured glitter. Now, speaking of glitter, I also purchased this from eBay. This came from a Chinese company. I think I bought about a dozen of these in various colours. Initially I thought I was getting a pigment dye, and it turned out to be this glitter instead. Now, the effect that you get with these is a little bit over the top. Now, it's certainly not subtle, but as you see shortly, you can mix and match from these materials to vary the effect. Now, I also purchased these. These are like an alcohol-based dye that you mix in with the resin. This is going to give you a tint, not an opaque colour. And this stuff is very, very thin. It mixes easily with the resin, but once again, a small amount goes a long way. Now, as you can see here, I've been through quite a few iterations of this design process, and there are essentially 3 different ways that this can fail. And I want to run through those before I show you what I think works. First failure mode would be having the resin seep into the open pores of the wood so that you get a blurring effect around the edge of the cutout area. And this is especially evident in this one here. So we have very light coloured timber, we've got a dark coloured filler in the resin, and you can see, I hope, quite clearly where the resin has wicked into the open grain of the timber. In this example here, you can see quite clearly that there are some bubbles. There's one at the bottom of that letter I, there's one over here on the end of the letter E, just here as well. And this is what happens when you try to put this into a vacuum chamber to get rid of bubbles. You can actually pull air through from the back. And the process I was using here was to seal the back of this piece of material with masking tape and then trying to suck the air out of the resin on top. But if that back isn't completely sealed, it'll just keep circulating bubbles through the mix. The other issue I found with this is not having enough contrast between the filler material and the wood that you've used for the background. All 3 of these here don't look too bad under the camera, but in real life they're a bit muddy and a bit lost. What I found now is that you've either got to use a white coloured timber, like a very light grained material, and then use a darker coloured filler, or use a dark coloured wood and then a powder filler in something like a bright yellow or a white. What I would like to do now is to step you through the process that I've developed for making these. I'm going to be using 4 different species of wood. This top one here is Malaysian teak, the darker coloured one. This is a native Australian timber called silver ash. These 2 here are from Tasmania. They're Huon pine. They're the only 2 softwoods I'll be using. This one is a native Queensland hardwood called southern silky oak. Now, these have been cut all the way through on the laser, and we're going to fill these with different mixtures, so different colours, different types of filler, and then we'll be finishing them off with a clear coat of epoxy resin on the top when we're done. When these laser cut blanks are cut, they're done from the back side with the image reversed. When you see them from the front side, what you end up with is razor sharp detail between the very small bridges in this part. So if you want good sharp edges on the top side, always cut it from the back. Now, you're probably looking at this and saying, well, that's all very good, but what would you do if you had a logo that included letters like O or P or R? In those cases, you get islands in the center of the letter, and they would simply become loose and fall out. So if we were to look at good old Walter White here, in the letter O in the word cook, and you can see that those little islands would easily fall out. So then you would have to do something to locate those islands when you want to pour the resin into the finished logo. So in those cases, what you do is you don't cut, you laser etch. Now, this has been done quite deeply. I'd be guessing that that cavity is probably around about 1 millimeter deep, and that allows you then to pour sufficient resin into that cavity to get the colour density that you want. Now, the only thing is, if you were to use like translucent colours or clear resin with a tint, then you're going to see that black colour at the back and the texture. But this works really well when you use a powder filler in the resin, which is totally opaque. Anyway, let's go and have a look at prepping this part and the other parts and get ready for the resin filling process. With Walter here, the preparation for him is to give him about 2 coats of clear acrylic lacquer, and the purpose of that is to seal the grain, especially where this engraved area bounds the surface of the timber here. And this is to avoid any of that liquid resin with the dye in it from penetrating through the open pores on the end of that engraved area. So I've got a spray can here, it's just a clear acrylic gloss, and when we paint this we need to try and get right into those edges. So we'll do that twice, and then we should be ready to pour the resin into that cavity. The process for prepping these little laser cut parts is a little bit different. What I'll be doing here is putting this into a tray of resin and then putting it inside a homemade vacuum chamber. Now the chamber is really just a Pyrex food dish. It's got a silicone seal around the top there, which is made from one of those sort of vegetable cutting mats. There's a valve in the top, and I've got a vacuum ejector. It's not really a pump. It uses air pressure from your compressor through this ejector here, and that creates a vacuum, and it's stored in this tank underneath here. There's an electric solenoid that controls the switch on, switch off for the ejector. Works pretty good. And the reason I'm using the process of pulling a vacuum on this is that it works well when you've got a cut edge, and the excess resin just simply can be mopped out of the opening and cleaned up quite easily. For the type where you've laser engraved it, you end up with sort of a pool of resin in the bottom of that engraved area that you've got to clean out in some way, because you want to fill that up with your coloured resin, not with clear resin. I'm mixing my resin here by weight. It's 2-to-1 mix, and of course you need to be very thorough in mixing this stuff. Make sure you scrape the edge of the container and not leave any pockets of unmixed resin. I've got a sort of rough and ready foil tray there, and we're just going to drop our laser cut part in the tray, and we just want to fill, not the whole tray, just want to fill the bit where the lettering is, so we can be sure that that resin gets pulled into the sides of the cut area. Not really worried about doing the whole part, just the bit where the resin is going to go later on. So we can put our lid on. Now I'm hoping you can see this, so I'll just zoom you in a bit so you can see a bit better. Filling up a bit of vacuum, and we're going to pull the vacuum on now, and just watch and you see some fine bubbles appear. So remember that the wood itself contains air, and as the vacuum extracts that air, the resin reaches into the pores and fills the void where the air used to be. Now I usually leave this for about 30 seconds to a minute. That seems to be all we need. Remember, we're not trying to completely fill the wood with resin, just the bit where we're going to be filling it with the colour. Alright, that should be enough. And all we need to do now is just mop up that excess resin. Okay, that looks pretty good now, so we'll just put this on a wire and hang it up to cure, about 24 hours. Okay, it's the next day, everything's cured and dry. These parts here, the resin is now quite hard, and on Walter that clear acrylic lacquer is set. So let's go ahead and get these ready. Now for this one, no preparation at all, that's already been done, but for these what we need to do is to close off the back side to stop any of that resin leaking through. So I'm just going to use ordinary masking tape. I just burnish that tape down quite firmly. Now it's important that there are no air leaks, because when we do pull the vacuum on this, we don't want to be sucking air through from the back. Okay, so now we can pour resin into that cavity. We know that it won't leak all the way through because the tape's on the back there, and also when we pull the vacuum, just to try and get rid of any of the bubbles in the resin, it's not going to circulate any air through from the back. Alright, what I've done is I've filled 6 of these little disposable shot glasses with a small amount of resin, and that's going to allow us to try 6 different styles of filling these things. Now, I'm not suggesting you need to do this, but this is just to demonstrate some of the techniques that I've been playing around with. And I must say, I'm not an expert. This is basically the first time I've ever done it. Now, what I'm using here is white powder coat. Now, this is going to give us a solid white opaque coating on this logo here, the one with the darker material. And that's going to provide that really good contrast. Now, why powder coat? Well, I have some, that's it. And I found that a powdered material means that when you pull a vacuum on it, the powder is going to get more or less filtered out as it tries to draw into the material. So you don't have that problem with the colour leaching into the wood. And that goes for the glitter as well, because you've got particles suspended in a liquid resin, and the particles don't want to, or they're not small enough to get absorbed by the pores of the material. So that's all I'm using. That's just ordinary powder coat. Now, you'll probably think I don't have powder coating materials, but you can buy powdered paints. So if you go to your art supply store and ask for powder paint, it's essentially, I think it's actually based on lime with pigments in it. So you can buy it in all different colours. And it's not expensive, and you can mix that in with your resin and you're good to go. So that's looking very much like sort of toothpaste, a little bit thinner maybe. So let's just pour that in. Already made a mess. And all we're looking to do here is completely fill that cavity and leave a bit extra on top. Now, I'd be guessing that you could overdo the amount of powder in this and end up making it sort of thick and stodgy, and it's probably not going to flow very well. And what we're looking to get is just some opacity. Okay, so that's sitting well above the surface there. Now, you've got plenty of time to work with this stuff. You've got basically about 4 hours working time, so there's no rush. So I'm going to leave that one as it is, and we'll mix up the next one. Okay, let's try some of this alcohol-based dye. This is described as reddish orange, and you just need a drop, 2 drops. So you can see that that's semi-translucent. The deeper it is, the thicker it is, the darker it's going to get too. Now just remember, this being a liquid mixed in with the epoxy resin, it'll have no trouble at all pulling into the pores on that material, and that's why I did that pre-treatment where I put it in the vacuum chamber and pulled it back in to try and seal off the cavity. And if you don't do that step properly, when you clean this off, you'll see like a fuzzy edge all the way around the outline where the liquid dye has been able to penetrate into the surrounding material. Okay, for our next one, we're going to try a liquid dye and some glitter, just to be a little bit tricky. So we're using a blue, and I've got a very almost an aqua color glitter. There's a lot of trial and error in this. You've got to sort of mix it and see how it looks. You know, quantities and proportion are important. So you can see the glitter quite clearly in that one. And the dye is, you know, probably overdone, probably put too much in there. We'll see how it goes. The good thing about this process is that, you know, it's not a lot of materials involved. That's why I'm doing 5 of these, and I can sort of pick and choose from the ones that I got and get the best one. For this one, I'm just going to try some straight glitter, I think. What do you reckon? Bit over the top? Probably. Right, for our last one, I'm going to try some of this mica powder. Okay, all of those nameplates are done. Let's do Walter now. Okay, I'm thinking for Walter, it's got to be black. After all, this is from his dark period. And I don't know, I think it deserves to be black. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you need to watch Breaking Bad. So again, I'm using black powder paint here. So you really have to use something like an opaque colour for this one. Okay, I've pretty much filled that now, and what we need to do is check each one now and make sure we don't have any bubbles in our resin. Now there are a couple of ways you can do this. You can pass a flame over the surface of the resin, or you can put it back in the vacuum chamber, or do a combination of both, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm just pulling the vacuum on that now, and you probably can't see, but I can find bubbles coming through the mix. They're obviously trapped underneath. There are 2 quite large bubbles there. Now you can either stir more resin back into the mix, or just let it collapse in on itself and refill that. And you might need to run the vacuum a second time to make sure you've cleared any of those bigger bubbles. They're not always visible on the surface. Okay, this time around it looks clear, but we'll run the torch over that just to be sure. Alright, for where I am, that looks nice and clear on the surface there now, very shiny. I can't see any small bubbles. Doesn't mean they're not there though. I think that one's done. We'll cycle through all the others and then we'll have a look at them tomorrow. Just taking the tape off these parts now, just to see what they're like in the back. And that's what I was worried about. That one's got some really severe bubbles in the back of it. Same with that one there. However, I've already taken the tape off the others and sanded off the front. And even though these have had bubbles in the back, the front seems okay. So we'll go ahead and get these ones sanded off and see what they look like. So I'm just using some double-sided tape here to put a wooden handle on the back of these so I can hang on to them for the sanding operation, which we'll do now. That one's got bubbles showing through in the front, so it's probably toast. I think I got lucky with the white one. Okay, our Walter's looking good. Well, that was 180 paper. We'll go to some 240 to finish off. That one's turned out pretty good. There are a couple of tiny bubbles, which are going to be an issue. I may be able to spot fill those locally, but I think that's okay. The white one looks okay. I think that's going to be pretty good, that one. This one's ruined. So I'm pretty sure that one's ruined, so I won't bother going any further with that. This one also looking pretty good. We'll go with that. I think that one also is going to be okay. So we'll finish up on those three at least, and Walter. I've just mixed up a small amount of clear resin just to finish these off now. So what I've done is I've sanded them smooth with a 240 grit paper. I've blown that off with compressed air. These are the two dodgy ones at the top, three at the bottom probably going to be the good ones, and we've got Walter over here. And with Walter I just cleaned the dust out of the little tiny bubbles that were left in the black resin. And because we can't see right through it, that should just fill with clear resin, and I don't think you're going to see it. But we'll just see how this goes. And this is where you see the colour start to appear. I'm just going to let that dribble over the sides. There's our one with the glitter in it. White one's a bit disappointing. The white is not quite as bright and vibrant as I thought it was going to be. But if you're after a subtle effect, maybe it's good. I'm not going to waste too much resin on these two here. But the blue does look good though. Let's see if we've got enough left for Walter. So just running a torch over this now just to burst little bubbles that are in the surface. Don't need to overdo it. If you get the light shining off it, you can see when you've actually removed all the bubbles. So these five here are looking good. Let's do Walter. That's pretty much it. So we'll let those cure and we'll have a look at them tomorrow. Well, these three here have turned out to be the most successful of the five that I did. This top one has got good contrast, but the white is not quite as bright as I would like it to be. The middle one with the hue on pine here, the colour is meant to be red. It's more like a very dark crimson. If you hold it up to the light, you can see straight through it, and then you see the colour. But this is going to be up against our surface, so we're not going to get that colour showing through. This bottom one here, well look, it's got more glitter than the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, let's put it that way. But normally I'm a conservative kind of guy, but somehow I like this. I think this is what we're going to go with. Can you see the glitter? It's beautiful. Well, there it is on the clock. I've just stuck it on with some double-sided tape. And in my view, a project's not really finished until you name it. So in this case, I'm calling this project done. There was a lot of work went into making these little wooden logos, but it's all about the learning process, isn't it? So there you go. That's how you make a resin-filled and laser-cut wooden logo for your projects. Okay, that's me, Prezzo, signing off. I'll catch you on the next video.